Okay, so let's get started with the next session. Take your seats. And so this session actually is dedicated to clinical trials, and not by chance, again, Markus and me will chair this session together to really foster the collaboration between patients and medical experts. And again, also for the clinical trials, of course, it's so important that patients and we as medical experts are together, design and put together the trials in a joint action. So what we want to do is we want to look at innovative clinical trial approaches for these rare type of cancers and for these ultra-rare cancers. And the idea is to have the perspective from different angles. We want to have the medical perspective, the perspective from the industry, and of course the patient perspective, and then at the end discussion all of that. So we will start with a medical perspective, and therefore it's my pleasure to invite Silvia Stacchiotti from Milan for the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Bernd and Markus, and thanks to SPAGN for inviting me here. It's really my privilege. And also thank you for listening. I think that today you are receiving a lot of information. Maybe not everything is easy. So please stop me if I'm too complicated or not supportive enough of your understanding. So, okay, these are my disclosure. Okay, we don't need to repeat again that sarcoma are many different tumor types and they are rare or even more than rare. We call some of them ultra rare. And to show how much they are discriminated is enough to look at the very short list of drugs that are approved for their treatment. So we have about 100 different tumor types and less than 20 agents that are formally approved in Europe. Let's compare with breast cancer. Let's say that breast cancer, including also the rare subtypes, are approximately 10 different types of tumor. We have more than 30 different drugs, while for 100 different kind of sarcomas, we have less than 20 agents. And this is also, worse if we look that also in the guidelines, there are many other drugs that are shown to be active, but are not formally approved. So the experts and patients do agree that these drugs should be available for patients, but instead they are not. And this is relevant to understand one first point. So, rare sarcomas and rare cancers are not only less attractive for the industry, especially when a drug is already on the market and is at the end of its development phase, but also that as patients and academia, we cannot ask for the approval of any drug. The approval of a new drug or the extension of the label of an old drug that is already on the market can be asked only to EMA, FDA, to the regulatory agency, only by the marketing authorization holder, meaning the company that is making the drug. So even if we have a very good academic study that is at the end positive, without the company that is making the drug and may have no interest in filing for the drug, we cannot proceed and ask for the approval of the drug itself. The situation is a bit better in the US, where the FDA has licensed a larger number of drugs. Approximately 50% more drugs are available for patients with sarcoma in the US compared to Europe. And it is very sad to notice that this gap has been growing as of 2019. Before that date, the lists were very similar. Now there are many more drugs that every year are approved in the US compared to what is happening outside the US. And also in the US, if you list a drug in the NCCN guidelines, and this applies to many different kinds of sarcoma, for example, immunotherapy is mentioned as a good agent for many histologies, But not only, also for ultra-rare sarcomas like IMT or like PEComa, there is a list of drugs that are thought to be effective for patients. In the US, and not only in the US, in some countries, it is enough to have one of these drugs listed in the guidelines to allow access to the majority of the patients. So there are different mechanisms across the world that make a drug available to patients once the expert, the physicians, do report that the drug makes sense in that disease. And this goes to a major concept. We do not have to fight only discrimination, but also disparity. And how can we work together to develop new treatments and fight this discrimination and disparity? So I strongly believe that we need to take a position as a community. We need to be a global community. And in an era where everything is happening around the world, trying to divide ourselves, instead we need to stick together. This is very much important. Then we need to unify effort at global level. And this is even more important when it comes to developing new clinical trials. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to run studies on very rare entities if we do not work together, if not all the patients who are affected by a given disease can participate into the trial. Then we need, as a community of experts and patients, and this is on us, not on the regulatory agency, to develop evidence and to improve the methodology. And finally, I think we really need to improve very much our liaison with pharmaceutical companies and regulatory bodies. And going to this concept, when it comes to developing new treatment, we have three different kinds of partners. We have pharmaceutical companies, who are the drug makers and developers. We have regulators and payers who decide at the end if a drug deserves to be approved and reimbursed. And we have researchers and patients. And historically, there is a very good connection between pharma and on one side the agency, and on the other medical doctors and patients, while the connection between, independent connection, between the regulatory agency, payers and researchers and patients is really much weaker. So we need to strengthen this relationship. We need to spend much more time in establishing a regular conversation with regulatory agency, because it is needed that we make them aware of the disease we are facing, what are the natural history, the drug available or not available, the prognosis, everything related to the diseases we are presenting, because often regulatory people are used to common cancer like breast cancer, lung cancer. They discuss new drug, new studies every day, but they don't know anything about pleomorphic rhabdomyosarcoma or PEComa or epithelioid hemangiosarcoma, because these kind of diseases were never presented to them before the new drug is discussed. Then we really strongly need to advocate for new rules for the approval of new drug in rare and ultra-rare indication. We will always fail if the same rules that are used for common cancer are asked to us. This does not mean to decrease the quality of the data that we have to present, but to change the rules. We need a lot more of simplification, because the processes that are there that need to be followed to ask for the consideration, the discussion of a drug and the approval are so difficult to understand that even within the same agency, a group can maybe not be completely aware of what kind of path is available for some kind of condition. And also we need to work together to try to favor very much what is about repurposing of drugs already approved in other indications. Repurposing what means that a drug that is already available for another tumor or another disease, even outside the cancer world, can be reused for example, a particular kind of sarcoma. Sirolimus is a drug that is used for transplantation, but can be helpful in some sarcoma type like PEComa. We know that, and we need to have a way to ask for opening the label, expanding the label, repurpose that drug. So this kind of discussion should be taken at regional level, so within the US, within EU, within all Asiatic countries, Canada and whatever, also at national level and at global level. We need to work on this through different layers if we want to succeed. And we need to ask for exceptional and innovative solutions. Ask means also to think of new solutions. We cannot just say we need new solution, new innovative solution. We need to propose, to be propositive. And for that, we need to work together again. So we have tried to start at least one of these kind of discussion with the ERTC, soft tissue and bone sarcoma group. We met together with the EMA, and also FDA was invited to join the discussion around how can we develop new treatments in ultra-rare sarcoma as a model for ultra-rare tumors. And this discussion was joined by many other stakeholders, like sarcoma experts from different parts of the world, not only in Europe, ERTC, but also from the US and Asia. There were colleagues who joined, and patient advocates, among which also SPAGN, and charities like Anti-Cancer Fund, the NCI, and a group of people, for example, in the pediatric world that are already trying to work around the same kind of problem. We have had so far 3 meetings, and my first take is that the way is long, but is doable. So the discussion can be done, and we are all part of the same, let's say, world, of the same mission, and if we, let's say, spend our time in meeting together, I'm very sure that this will improve all the problems that we are facing every day. And not only that, the discussion was translated into a manuscript that we would like to submit soon, in which altogether we agreed that to develop drugs in rare cancers requires different approaches, different methodologies. And not only that, but also that not only data from clinical trials, but also from registries, from patients, from observational studies should be part of the documentation that is used at the time a drug is discussed. And also, we agreed that we need to build a regular place where we can meet to discuss each single tumor and the new drugs that are available for that kind of tumor. On the other side, again with the ERTC soft tissue and bone sarcoma group, together with this more broader general discussion, we started talking of very specific entities, because having examples can help very much the discussion. So between 2020 and 2024, we had a lot of conversation around alveolar sulfur sarcoma. And what was clear during that conversation was that if we don't explain what is our tumor, what are the challenges we are facing, on the other part of the table it's very difficult to be aware of what we are talking about. And similarly, discussion was conducted around epithelioid hemangiendothelioma. To both this discussion, but especially to the second one, the participation, the involvement of patients was crucial. First, we would never been aware of this call sent out by the EMA about a repurposing project without being informed by patients. So basically, we're the patient who came to us and said, oh, what if we consider to participate into this initiative from EMA? Second, during the discussion that took 3 years, the presence of the patient raising every day that they feel the urgency of having new drugs, that they are dying, that they need a treatment, was very much relevant in keeping the motivation and the, let's say, the attitude, the positive, without, stopping in front of the first issue he had. So meeting together, we met several times. I cannot even count how many times we met virtually with EMA. We could show what is the disease, and this was done also with the support of patients. For that occasion, we asked EHE global community to go around to collect data about the disease and treatments, to gather all this data and to publish this data. And these data were part of the documentation that we submitted for consideration. We made them aware of all the challenges, including the fact that, for example, RECIST criteria do not fit with this disease. All the drugs that we are using so far cannot shrink the tumor as much as is required to fit a partial response by RECIST. We showed that thinking of a randomized study is impossible. The disease is too rare. To run such a kind of study would take such a big amount of sites all around the globe, such a long period of time, such a big amount of money that would be simply impossible. And also, we showed that there is no interest, any interest from pharmaceutical companies, in particular with regard to sirolimus. We went back several times together asking, would you like to give us at least the drug for running the study? And the answer was always no. And I think that also EMA had to realize that the company were totally, completely not interested in considering any study, any development of the drug in the disease. So what point have we learned from this discussion? First, EMA made clear that the discussion has to be disease and drug specific. We cannot, from the discussion we had for EHE and sirolimus, draw conclusion that can be immediately, directly applied to other tumors. On our side, this means that we should have a space where we can discuss every time we need the disease and the drug that we want to put on the table. Also, that even if the retrospective data are very good, prospective data are always required. The label extension of a drug in a new indication cannot be based only on retrospective data. Prospective data are required. And what kind of prospective data, particularly for EHE? So a very important agreement was, again, to say that randomized prospective data are not mandatory. So we could agree that, especially for very rare indication, randomized studies are not always needed. We can do without them. A single-arm phase 2 study can be accepted. But then what endpoint? The primary endpoint can be overall response rate. But in this case, we need a tumor that can shrink with a given drug, at least in a proportion of patients around 30–40%. If a treatment does not shrink the tumor and instead stabilize the disease, what could be the alternative? And the comment was that disease control rate and progression-free survival at a given time point for EHE 12 years could work. So, after this long discussion, we could agree about a, let's say, not conventional endpoint for a single-arm study. This is a very important point. This is a very important result of the discussion we had. But then, what if, after having this potential design, we don't have the company with us? What if we cannot conduct the study because we do not have the drug? Another very, very big achievement we had was the agreement that a prospective observational study mimicking a phase 2 study could be acceptable. What does this mean? Running a prospective phase 2 study requires the drug. The cost of the drug must be covered. When you run an observational study, and basically you are registering patients who are receiving the treatment that every day is given to a patient, the cost of the drug has not to be covered. It's part of the regular treatment of the patient. So the cost for such a kind of study are totally affordable. So this is a huge difference. So basically the proposal was we can have an observational study where all the patients with epithelioid hemangiendothelioma are included, and those treated with the sirolimus will be part of a sub-study where we can predefine the endpoints and some other secondary endpoints, collect the data, and in this way produce prospective data on the drug in the disease. And this is the protocol. We have worked out a lot together with the patient community, with also methodology to collect pain information and also radiology and so forth. So there was a lot of work, a lot of time spent with the idea of using a platform that is called PUSH, in which RedCap, that is a platform where we can collect the CRF data, can be used for free by everyone, and all the study data can be incorporated and then analyzed. Then we have another problem. Once the study is hopefully positive, how can we do with the data if the company is not on board? The answer could not at this point solve the problem. So basically, we are at the point that we can run a study that is observational with a given endpoint, with everything that in case of a positive result could fit the regulatory agency expectation, but without the company on board, we will not be able to move forward. And this is the kind of barrier that we need to fight, but at present is there. There is a very important reform under discussion at EU level, and this is the new pharma regulation. Within this reform that has been discussed as of 2021, there is a paragraph called paragraph 048, and in this paragraph is written that also patients and academia can file for approval when there is not any interest of the pharmaceutical company. So if this law is approved, goes through, it means that repurposing can not only be asked by pharmas, but also by us. This is a very big change. We really hope that this is going to be accepted. This would make very much important all the data that we are collecting in a good way in academic study, because this means that the data will be usable, will be available for discussion about repurposing, label extension, and so forth. And we really need to stick together to ask for the approval of this new legislation. Then, what else? Is that enough? For sure it's not enough. As I said before, was made clear that we need for each sarcoma subtype to have the chance of discussing together. So it's of course necessary for us to establish a dedicated pathway, a procedure where the discussion can take place. Pediatricians do have something similar. There is a platform called Accelerate that is organized outside the regulatory agency, where the regulatory agency, FDA, EMA, can join the academia, pharmaceutical company, and discuss about a given drug in a given disease. This kind of pathway is not available for us as sarcoma community. And we put as part of the discussion with the EMA, what if we try to establish this kind of framework? Why not? And also, why not establishing this framework, we try to provide general guidance that accounts for the majority of the likely scenario we have. For example, we can have sarcomas that are slow growing, in which RECIST cannot work. There are sarcoma in which symptoms are more relevant than radiologic response. So can we define some general principle to investigate new drugs where randomization is not feasible in single arm trials, agreeing on what is required for having valuable data at the end. And of course, now I go because this is too much, but just to say that if this framework is agreed upon, we will have a lot of work to do, because this kind of workshop will be on us. We will have to make available all the documentation to discuss about PEComa, clear cell sarcoma, desmoplastic round cell tumor, as we did for EHE. And we know very well how much time we had to put into preparing everything that was needed for the discussion on EHE. And I strongly believe that here the role of patient advocates is so much important, so much important. Okay, so, and also, another of the challenges that we often face is that at the level of the regulatory agency and payer, as said before, we have people that are not aware of what means developing drugs in rare indications. So what we ask for is to have on the other side of the table expert, as we are expert in sarcoma, and we don't invite a breast cancer person to talk about sarcoma, would be much better if as representative of the regulatory agency, we can have some of the people who took part of the discussion and now know what are the problems that we are facing every day. So what we asked for was also a group of expert people within the agency as a let's say, partner in trying to improve what we can do. How can we achieve all of this? Of course, I do not have a final answer for that, but for sure there is an initiative, I said before, that is called PUSH, at least for ultra-rare sarcoma, that is aimed at working in a similar way than Accelerate. We made this proposal to EMA. The first reaction was a bit, I would say, uncertain, but we had time to go back again, and we said, we know that the funding, the resources that the agency do have for these are not enough. But if we can take care as academia and patient advocates of organizing every time the discussion, of putting together the framework where the discussion can take place, this maybe is doable. And then we will take care of inviting all the stakeholders, the companies, the academia, like the ERTC or, SARC or whatever, who need to be part of the discussion without giving the weight of all these operational aspects to the agency, but with the chance at the end to meet together, to take decision and to get out from there with possible solution. So the idea is that everything is very much complicated, and I absolutely don't want to discourage anyone. I just want to say that we can make it, but we need a lot of effort in that. And effort means time, resources, and creativity. We need to be able to propose new solutions and to offer a pathway that were never, taken before. For that, we absolutely need you. PUSH is only one of the initiatives and is meant to be global. It's not now the place to talk about that, but just to say that, particularly with the Sarcoma Foundation of America, we are working hard, and many people in the room are involved, like, of course, Bernd and Vinette in that. And I hope that this can, let's say, increase the enthusiasm and the hope that working together we can do really a lot.
Thank you very much, Silvia. Yeah, please join us here. Okay, thank you. We will shift gears now and have the company statement or the company perspective, and it's my pleasure to invite Uche from Springworks Therapeutics for his statement.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Uche, as Bernd mentioned. I'm also informed that I'm the very first industry speaker at this set of meetings, which makes me very nervous. And if you decide after my talk not to invite anybody else, I'll take it very personally. All right. Having said that, this is my disclaimer. I'm going to share my perspective, right? Not my company's viewpoint. So these are all my reflections. And I hope at the end of the conversation, we can have a panel discussion. There's a lot stacked in here. I'm not going to go through every single one of them because there's just so much to talk about. And 10 minutes isn't enough to do justice to the topic. Let me just frame the challenge, right? I think all of us can appreciate that my industry, the one that I work in, has a very awesome task. Our task is to advance human health, but we're also a business, right? So I think we have to balance both of those. So the challenge we face, especially in rare disease drug development, is the challenge of high cost of development, small patient populations to conduct clinical trials, which come with its own challenges, high risk of failure during development. I think you all know the statistics. Not every drug that makes it into phase 1 gets into the marketplace. And it's very difficult to recoup, right, the investment for a lot of various reasons. Importantly, though, rare disease drug development is done by small biotech companies. And these are companies that have very limited capitalization. And we have investors backing us who are really very penal. If you make a very small mistake in clinical trials, you get really punished. So that puts a lot of pressure on drug developers. And I think this results in a situation where the technologies we bring forward are high-cost products because there's a very small patient population, and consequently, only high-income countries can generally afford access to these drugs. And nobody likes that, but that is reality. There are a lot of things that are working, though. It's not all doom and gloom. There's some great things that are working. I think governments across the globe have done a lot of work to put forward legislation, I won't go through them all that are listed here, to encourage and support rare disease drug development. And these efforts have been quite successful. I'll share some insights. The benefits to our industry, though, I think is worth just commenting on, because many men might not know. There are tax credits that governments are willing to give drug developers for all the money we spend in R&D. That is very helpful. Exclusivity in the marketplace is really good because it incentivizes innovation. The US and the EU are a little bit different. In the US, it's 7 years post-marketing exclusivity. In EU, it's 10 years. But the EU is contingent upon re-establishing the basis of your orphan designation in the first place before you get authorization. So that's some nuances there. We have a special support from regulators when it comes to protocol development. I think that's important to point out because smaller biotech companies don't have the depth of knowledge that large companies have. So we lean on the regulators to help us walk through the process of protocol development and study execution, and that is always very helpful. These legislations provide grants, not just for industry, but for academics to actually do trials in drug development for rare diseases. I don't know if many people know that, but they're there. We get waivers of PDUFA fees, for example, to again provide more incentives for us. And there are many other things that come to us as a benefit. So again, a lot of stuff is working. I want to make sure that's understood. In the US, just some data that I think all of you will be very familiar with, but it just bears going over. Since the Orphan Drug Act was passed in the US in 1983, in a 4-decade time since then, there have been over 6,300 orphan drug designations in the US across 1,000 rare diseases. But this represents only 10% of all rare diseases. So a lot of success, but there's still a lot of gap. In terms of the actual approvals, 882 orphan drug indications have actually been approved by the FDA, about a 14% success rate, not bad. Half of all FDA approvals in the past 4 or 5 years have gone to orphan drug indications. So there's a lot of momentum behind orphan drug development as a result of the legislation that has been put forward. Oncology has been a particularly important beneficiary of this movement. As you can see, the data support that about half of all ODDs, that's the designations, and 37% of all approvals only go to 5% of all rare diseases. Again, making very clear that it's a very big gap. Oncology has done well. About 40% of all approvals or 40% of the indications for orphan drug designation go to oncology. So not a bad place to be. So again, a lot of progress has been made, but there's a lot of gap, right? There are 89% of rare diseases that haven't had a single orphan drug designation. I know it's not just about oncology, but the reason I mentioned that is there is a reason for oncology succeeding, and that is some of the incentives that have been put behind oncology. And I think if it can be put to other rare diseases, I'm very useful as well. The story in Europe is fairly similar, but I think, Silvia mentioned this. There's a little gap in Europe in terms of the approvals around rare diseases, and I think the data from the EMA website support this. Over 3,000 orphan medicinal product designations in Europe since the Act was passed, 260 or so approvals. In the past 10 years, for which data are available, 1,700 orphan medicinal product designations, 176 approvals, that's only 9%, a little bit less than what the US is, which is 14%. If you look at all drug approvals and then look at orphan medicinal product approvals in Europe, it represents 18% of all approvals. In the US, it's over 50%. So I'm not sure why the gap is there, but maybe that's some of the stuff that we can look into, maybe working with regulators to make sure that what is succeeding in one jurisdiction can also be learned and extended to other jurisdictions. That's some important considerations, and I'm not going to go through all this list because these things are very, I think you all know this, but I want to just point out 3 important considerations because I think going forward, these represent opportunities. The role of decentralized clinical trials and digital health technology is an area that excites me personally, and I'm sure that in oncology rare disease trials, there'll be a lot of gain from this, because if you think about it, rare disease patients live in very disparate places. Forcing patients to travel sometimes miles to get to a centralized clinical trial center is a hurdle. It's a big hurdle. It's a hurdle economically as well. It's a hurdle for patient care providers who have to oftentimes take time off work to take these patients to clinical trial centers. So if we can actually accelerate guidance and implementation around decentralized clinical trials with inclusion of digital health technologies like wearables and figure out how to safeguard privacy and safety of those data, I think that will help provide more incentives for companies to go into this space. The second area is the need for historical control cohorts. And I'll speak to this when I come to the next slide about the role of natural history studies. It will be a very big boost to my industry if there's existing natural history studies. Because if we think about it, small biotech companies have a new technology, they're coming to a space, they really have no deep knowledge of that space, right? And if there are existing natural history studies that have already characterized the patient journey and potentially even defined what a registrable endpoint might be that is patient relevant, it creates an incentive and removes a hurdle for entry. The third thing I want to point out in terms of regulatory considerations is the need for post-approval data collection. By definition, rare disease drug development means that you don't understand your safety profile of your asset during traditional development. So there's a need for ongoing safety characterization. And of course, health authorities have a right, and they do ask for ongoing data collection. The flexibility around the timing and the demand of those data collections is one that I think my industry will benefit from, because again, small sample size patient populations, adoption of the technologies after approval is not always very uniform, right? Because again, it's dependent on access to care and all the cost considerations. So, some thoughts for further considerations. Patient advocacy groups and medical research organizations have a huge role to play. Again, I want to highlight 3 or 4 areas of interest. It's a long list of things here. Establishing good research consortia that are linked to patient foundations is really important for 2 reasons. Site and key expert identification helps us initiate trials. You know who these people are, you establish links with them, you actually establish what is required to get a drug approved, a trial off the ground. That provides infrastructure operationally for a small company coming into the field to leverage and get into a clinical trial. Secondly, I mentioned natural history studies. I cannot overemphasize how important this is. The success that my company has had in the 2 areas that we've actually worked on, one is desmoid tumors and the second is plexiform neurofibromas, is because we're a very strong patient advocacy group that had already established proof of concept, established a natural history, a disease contact registry, and most importantly, a clinical trial network that we could actually leverage. So it made it easy for us to come into the space, work with the PAGs, and get our trials off the ground. So I can't overemphasize how important that is. And then the third part of this is, I think I mentioned, helping develop patient-relevant and clinically relevant endpoints that can enable a registration of a new product. I think that's really important to us. And everything else that I think makes sense, but I won't spend too much time on them for time considerations. So I have 2 slides on what I call potential concerns, watch outs. A lot of times governments do pass legislation and they have unintended consequences. And I want to just put down an example. In the US, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in 2022 for a lot of good reasons, I'm very sure. But embedded in the IRA was a requirement that Medicare should look at top-selling drugs, and the number keeps changing, 15 or 20, depending on the year. But the idea is, for Medicare's Part B and D, for drugs that are the top-selling drugs that are required to do price setting. You may think that's okay, that's probably okay. However, the rules require that price setting be focused on products. If you're a small molecule, 7 years from approval. If you're a biologic, 11 years from approval. All makes sense. If you think about it though, a lot of oncology products, and rare oncology products in particular, have life cycle extension studies that go on. So further development of drugs for new indications after approval occurs a lot in oncology. 62% of oncology products have new approvals after the initial approval. That's a lot of oncology products. And if you look specifically the time that this occurs, they mostly occur 7 years after initial approval. Right? So depending on how this act is implemented, it could be a disincentive for further development of new indications, and I think that might impact rare disease oncology in particular. The other area, and I won't go into this, but I just want to mention because it's real, I think, again, Silvia alluded to this, the complexity of the landscape of the HTAs in Europe creates a hurdle for us. If there's a way to harmonize, especially the clinical benefit risk assessment across the larger markets, so that we don't have to repeat this in every market we go to, that will definitely help in drug development. And in some of these markets, it takes 2 years to get to market after approval. Shortening that time frame will be very beneficial to us. I want to end on what I see as a big opportunity, and that is within the US in particular, there are provisions in legislation that actually provide grants for research. And I'm particularly keen to see what we can do to expand access to grants for natural history studies. There's the Natural History Studies Grant Program that the FDA adjudicates, and I went to the website just to take a look. In the past calendar year, only 3 of 53 grants were approved, 3 of 53. Now, I don't know the quality of the grant proposals, so I'm not going to comment on those, but we can all agree that 3 grants approved of 53 is very small, right? And the total budget around that was $4.7 million. So I'm not sure if people aren't asking the right questions and making the right proposals, but if we can actually leverage this, given the importance of natural history studies for rare disease drug development, has an opportunity to do more. Right? So again, I've shared a lot of thoughts. I've gone through a lot of material very quickly. I'm sure there's more to talk about, but this is the end of my prepared remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Uche. Please join us. So now we come to the patient perspective. So we actually have 2 statements from the patients. The first one is from Roger Wilson, who unfortunately cannot be with us here today. So we have a recorded statement from him, which we will hear now. Hopefully.
It's good to be with you. Those of us who are involved in clinical trials have been learning more and more about new methods and study designs during the last few years. We have crossovers, umbrellas and baskets, platforms, adaptive trials and TWICs, trials within cohorts. There is real-world health data and increasing use of patient-reported outcomes, all adding further complexities. Our researchers are leading the way. I would identify ICONIC in osteosarcoma and Strexit2 in retroperitoneal sarcomas as having truly innovative methods and valuable potential outcomes. To get data, the study relies on medical observation and, increasingly, tissue sampling brings more input from laboratory science. New imaging techniques add further technology opportunities. PROs bring patient questionnaires into studies, and finding the right questions without creating a questionnaire burden can be a challenge. With some therapies, we may in future see trials based at home, or remote sensors providing data, possibly even making greater international expansion of a study possible. We're starting to see personalized immunotherapy based on individual genetically identified biomarkers. And we're seeing trial endpoints which are about response to therapy taking over from survival outcomes. It's all generating a lot of data, and we also need to see ways of exchanging and merging data to allow second tiers of retrospective research to be undertaken. Getting patients to consent for that to happen is also crucial for our future research. Our objectives of SPAGN, however, must remain constant. When we review studies or take part in discussions about trial design, we want studies to answer a clear question about patient benefit. We want innovation, and we want patients to support it, but patient benefit is the priority. We have some constants. Patients taking part in a study should not be disadvantaged long-term, nor should they face life-threatening short-term side effects. A trial must have the objective of benefiting identified patient groups if the experimental treatment is to come into standard of care. There's a balance of benefit versus burden for us to find. And don't forget the human issues in that. Travel and car parking, overnight accommodation, issues like biopsies. They all influence whether patients want to join a study. So please keep that in mind. A clinical trial is not an unlimited experiment, and there are issues we can be aware of, but which the researchers might not identify. Drug development through biological and chemical experiments calls for thorough laboratory testing before it can be introduced to humans in clinical trials. This journey can take 10 years or more and cost hundreds of millions of dollars. But clinical research is not just about drugs. We want surgical questions answered. 40 years ago, the first endoprostheses replaced cancerous bones in the leg, avoiding amputations. Finding ways to make those bones grow in length as a child grew up took nearly 20 years to get a satisfactory answer, but have resulted in amazing outcomes. Another example is a study today looking at how fluorescence can help a surgeon identify margins during surgery. All these developments need trials and a rigorous approach. Innovative thinking brings together different therapeutic methods and disciplines. For example, adjuvant radiotherapy before or after surgery is another sarcoma research area already underway. It aims to get full answers about doses and timing. A further current study is STRAS-2, looking at chemotherapy prior to surgery in a group of high-risk retroperitoneal sarcoma patients. It is this kind of thinking together, collaboration, which we must encourage from our researchers and doctors. And we too can be innovative. We can help accrue patients into clinical trials, whether this is by finding ways to help trials expand their reach into new parts of the world, or by helping patients to understand better what trials can mean for them, what a specific trial can mean for them, and thus speeding up recruitment into research. Meetings like this are such an important part of the dialogue. Have a good discussion, and I'm sorry to miss it.
Thank you very much, Roger. Last speaker in this round now is Denise Robinson from the EHE Foundation, also with a second patient statement.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, SPAGN, for organizing this meeting and inviting me to speak about the patient perspective in clinical trials. I want to start by also, I want to thank the investigators and the sponsors that are in the room, because in my disclaimers, I say that I'm making generalized statements, but I want to make sure that I thank the people that mentor us who are in this room, because this is really important. There are challenges here that we can overcome, but there are a lot of people that don't get into this room, and we have to keep that in mind. So I want to say that I am not a survivor of an ultra-rare cancer or a rare cancer, nor are any of my direct relatives. I was impacted by someone personally being affected by EHE, which brought me to this space. My professional background is in clinical trial operations, which I flipped over into patient advocacy. So I bring kind of a different perspective to this talk because it's something that I've lived for the last 2 decades. I do really personally believe that clinical trials should be an option in every patient's care plan. I think that it is something that should be revisited. It's not something to think about when you're first diagnosed or when you get a new doctor. I think it is something that you should always consider because the clinical trial landscape changes daily, really. And again, my statements are generalized. They're not meant to be too critical of the system. Much like what Roger said, there have been a lot of innovations in clinical trials. Really, the world has come a long way, and this has opened up many opportunities, but the execution of clinical trials still relies on an old model, and that old model works really well for big cancers and big cancers that have big data. Small companies, the companies struggle, the clinical investigators struggle, and we as patient advocates struggle. Sponsors, it's my perception, and I think that we all could agree on this probably, sponsors and clinician scientists often are hesitant to involve patients advocates early on in meaningful planning of a clinical trial. Someone said this yesterday, and it really resounded with me. Do we bring value? What does that mean to us? Are we helping the system? Is it too much work to bring us in early? Are we too disruptive in bringing our ideas forward? Maybe I'm saying something that you've thought, but these are things that are problems. Trial accessibility, Roger also alluded to this. Trial accessibility is something that has been talked about in clinical trial operations. Sponsors have been talking about this. CROs have been talking about this for a long time. But have we really made a lot of progress there? Have clinical trials become easier to get to? I can tell you that for our population, the clinical trial centers still follow the outside of the United States, and they follow the major centers in rest of world. Patients live everywhere. Even if I lived in rural New York for a while, patients in my community struggled to get to a clinical trial. It's really hard to get from one point to another when you're very sick. So we have to make this easier. And inclusion-exclusion criteria need to be, you have to select the right patients to have your study, but we need to think about having reasonable inclusion-exclusion criteria in trials. The last point here, and these are not meant to be all of the challenges, of course, but the last point is a big one. Trial participation is a choice. It is a tough choice for people who are already facing a lot of hard choices. So back to my clinical trial operations background, we would always say, talk with someone you trust. Often, most often, that is your care team. It could be your nurse navigator, it could be your PA, it could be your oncologist. Talk with your care team about a clinical trial. You might talk with someone of faith that you believe can help and guide you. You might talk with your family, but talk with someone you trust. But I can tell you that what we witness in the ultra-rare space is that patients are talking to their clinician, who is a care provider, not any of the care providers often in this room who are clinical trialists. So they're talking to a care provider who really can't help them about a clinical trial. They don't know anything about the clinical trial, they don't know anything about the drug, and they probably aren't going to pick up the phone and call and find out. You have to do that as a patient on your own. We as advocates are trying to help those patients as best we can. but you need a lot of arms and legs to do that. I will say that advocacy is the place of trust for patients to come to. Patients can trust that they can come to advocates, they can get unbiased information, and they can get forwarded along to a clinical trialist. So I think that that is a solution that advocacy brings to clinical trials, and a good reason for sponsors and clinical trialist investigators to engage with advocates. Make sure that we get those patients to you so that you can decide if that patient is right for the trial. So I'll highlight on some opportunities for improvement. There are lots, many have been talked about. I've put here sponsors and KOLs. KOLs, key opinion leaders. So the people, the clinical trialists who are in this room, investigators, these are thought leaders. These are the people that sponsors should rely on. We want them to have those people, they know these patient populations well. We want them there, but it has to involve patients and patient representatives early in that process. Successful study feasibility. I don't know if many of you in this room know what study feasibility is, but it is a process by which you look to see, is that protocol doable? Can we find those patients? Will those patients do these assessments in the trial? Is this something that will work? That discussion should involve patients and sites. Studies start up and often we jump right out into site feasibility. Let's find 10 sites, can they enroll these patients, and let's go. But we need to take a step back, and before you bake that protocol in to say, we're going to have an elective biopsy, we're going to do these assessments, what PROs are we going to put in, please make sure that we're talking with patients. Now, I'm saying all of this, and I want to say that communication is going to be key. I'll come to that in just a second. Someone just mentions cohort studies. That's another point that's really, I think it's overlooked because there are, I search clinicaltrials.gov all the time. We're looking for pan-sarcoma studies. Can we find a study that we could get a cohort of EHE patients? But if you as a clinical trialist, if you're standing up a study, or as a sponsor, if you're thinking about expanding an indication and you want to study a population, and you say, let's put a cohort in of 10 patients of this subtype, then you need to engage that subtype. You need to talk to those people, and then you need to make sure that those investigators know to talk to those same people so that we can get the right patients to those studies. It's really, really important. The cohort isn't just an add-on to the study. It should be filled, and it should be filled with the right people. I want to talk a little bit about communication, because communication seems a simple thing that we could all do better, but it is a lot of work for the leaders and my peers in this room. We're busy people, and we're trying to do a lot of things that we simply don't know how to do. We're learning by fire, really. But communication is something that is important, and it's important that it happens early, but it happens ongoing. It doesn't necessarily have to happen often, but as studies, in my opinion, as studies are, you're rolling out the study, where are we in the site selection? Have we gotten that protocol baked, and are we ready to go to the IRB? And then as the study rolls along and we go through phases of the study, are we looking at doing protocol amendments? What is working, what is not? What is that data showing? What do we need to add to this study to enrich that study? These are things that patients could come to the table and talk about with you. I think that it's just a lot of work. That's something that we as patient advocates, I want more of my investigators' times. I want more of the sponsors' time, but I have to give that time too. So I have to say, build capacity, eat your Wheaties, because it's going to be a whole lot of work. And lastly, and Roger touched on this too, make a plan to retain participants. And this goes to really sponsors more than anyone else. Retention is often just kind of a byline. It's something that you have to check that box. Everybody wants to know what you're going to do to retain those patients. And it is a great gesture to include $500 for travel and accommodation per visit for a patient to go to a study. But in today's world, that doesn't go very far. When you need to travel over an airplane, you need to stay overnight, you have to bring a care partner, you have to take public transportation, or you have to rent a car. And then you're going to go back home, and for 3 weeks, you're going to feel isolated. So make sure that you take care of your clinical investigators who can be helped with resources, with your resources, to help maintain touch points with those patients and make sure that those patients are not burdened. The burden of getting to a clinical trial, there's enough burden by getting in the car. There shouldn't be other burdens to get into a clinical trial. I think that this is something that we can overcome. I really, really do. These are not hard things, really. And I think that we can all work together to give good input on how we can overcome those things. So again, working together. I really think that the future is really, really bright. Things have come a long way. I'm glad to be standing in this room talking about clinical trials for rare and ultra-rare cancers, because I feel that in my career 10 and 20 years ago, people would have said, we can't find those patients, we're not going to do that study. But today, because of you, people are looking for those patients, and people can find those patients. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Denise. And before we open the floor for questions, we also have a representative from the FDA in the room, and it's my pleasure to invite Martha to the podium as well. We didn't ask her for a formal statement, but of course we would be interested to hear her perception on that and her idea on all that topic. And so maybe you can just introduce yourself and say.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm Martha Donahue. I'm a pediatric oncologist by training, and I've been at the FDA now 15 years. It's hard to believe. My current position is I'm the Associate Director for Pediatric Oncology and Rare Cancers in the Oncology Center of Excellence at the FDA. And a big part of my job really lies in helping to coordinate the regulatory work involved in drug development for biologics as well as small molecules for pediatric patients, all of who with cancer, all pediatric cancers are rare, of course, as well as other rare cancers, and working with the oncology review divisions that oversee that product development. And it's a pleasure to be here. I feel very honored, and I can only say that I think I agree with everything all of you have said, unless it was critical of the FDA, in which case, of course, I don't agree. But I think this focus on communication, which I think, as you said, Denise, is not hard, but it does take a lot of time. I think it's extraordinarily important. And, I think many of you, all of you really highlighted that. And so, I think you said it much better than I can. What I would say, and just tag teaming off of what you have said, is that one thing that I have said many times, and I know a lot of my colleagues have said many times, is that we would very much like to be involved in discussions about products developed for rare cancers as early as possible. And ideally, we would like those discussions to occur with a representative from every stakeholder community involved at the table at the same time. So that includes sponsors, of course, patient advocates, scientists, as well as other regulators if we have that opportunity. And I think it's when we have those opportunities that the challenges associated with product development really can be addressed in a most efficient way. That's not to say that we have to be involved in every conversation, because there are many types of trials that happen, some of which don't have anything to do with the intention to get a drug approved. But for those development programs where you anticipate and want a product to be approved, we would very much like to be part of it and have every representatives from every community possible talking to us together. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. And so I would now like to open the floor for your questions. I mean, the statements actually took a bit longer than we expected, so there is not so much time for a big discussion, but I would actually just leave the floor for your question. Brandy.
Hi, I'm Brandy. I'm from the Southern Foundation of America, and I'm shorter than the microphone. I have written my question on paper just to organize my thoughts, so it's not long, but I just want to work on it. But I did want to say, I too agree that decentralized trials are really of interest, and I really believe they could be a game changer for sarcoma, but that's not my question. My question is about, I really appreciate incorporating the policy and legislation into this conversation. Also, SFA is based in the DC area, so we work a lot on policy. And one of the things, we also host a Hill Day in July, so we can have our voices heard on Capitol Hill. But that said, we're also involved in many policy conversations about data and trial design and things, but one of the other things we are involved in actually currently is price negotiation. And right now CMS is holding panels and town halls on particular drugs, one of which is actually breast cancer, but used off-label for a subtype of sarcoma. And so we are working right now to get our statement included into the discussion with CMS. We try to get patients on the panels, but we're trying to get statements from the rare community, especially sarcoma, into the discussion. But one of the things that came up last week, and I actually have a call on this on Tuesday, so this is perfect timing to get a little feedback and education from me and others in the room. But one of the things that came up is when the price is being negotiated, there could be an impact to off-label use and further research in that particular therapy, and what that impact could look like for rare diseases or rare cancers. So I don't know, from our standpoint, as we're thinking through what our statement and how we should represent, especially the sarcoma community in this discussion, I think it would be interesting to hear from you, since you brought it up in terms of the price negotiations and how that could or not affect off-label use or further research in terms of the price negotiation. I know it's long, it turned out to be long, sorry.
So thank you for the question. You didn't mention my name, but you're looking at me, so I assume that for me. That's all right. That's okay. So very quickly, I think it's a very important point. Two things just to comment on rapidly. The power of advocacy cannot be really overemphasized, right? The whole Orphan Drug Act itself, I think, is a result of the NORD advocacy. The fact that Health Canada changed their perspective, their initial take on orphan drug policy was they didn't need one. Well, the Canadian group organized and formed CORD as a sister of NORD, and they changed their policy. So advocacy is critical. Let me just keep driving that point home. You can do a lot more than we on the sponsor side can certainly do, because we come with a very clear perspective, and oftentimes, it's not very, very, very impactful. But to your question, the impact of price negotiations, I alluded to this, especially in rare oncology development, can be huge, right? Many of the assets that come to market have further indications developed. A lot of the new investments that lead to those approvals come after the first approval has occurred. So depending on how the negotiation goes, you might actually find where companies are no longer investing in further approvals after the initial indication has been gained. Now, the industry perspective, if you look at pharma, is very clear on this. They've actually surveyed pharma members, and 3/4 of pharma companies indicated directly that this IRA 2022 Act and the impact on CMS and how they negotiate prices is creating uncertainty for new investments, right? So there are things you can bring, and it's actually fact-based. This is not, it's really what pharma is saying. So I think you can write your response in a way that highlights, right, that threat, and people can actually then make decisions based on the proper information once you give it to them. But that's the way I would pose. I don't know if it helps you at all, but that's the way I'll pose the argument.
There is also another point that pertains more Europe and about pricing, and this is that every time you rediscuss of a drug in each country, because you know that in Europe you have EMA approval, and then the discussion around pricing at every country level. Every time you rediscuss of a drug in a new indication, the price for the drug is rediscussed and usually lower, not only in that indication, but in all the older indications. And this is a very big barrier in, making this drug file for approval in Europe. So, for example, the reason why atezolizumab was never filed for approval to EMA was probably not that the study was a single-arm study with not too many patients, but just because the company was worried of losing money for a rare indication due to a lowering of the price in the other indication where the drug was already approved. So again, if we do not change the rules, it's going to be very tough for rare cancers.
Any further questions? Please.
Kramer, Founder Sarcoma Foundation. This was a great presentation. I know we can talk about the issues for a long time. I want to just address three. One is trial accessibility. Seems to me, it is a major burden for patients to go to a site, especially if they live 700, or 500 miles away, and just the travel expenses needed and the time that it takes to do it. It would be great if we could look at remote sites, like closer to where they live. And I see that as a tool for recruitment too, to get other oncologists from, areas, and it could be, globally, to participate and learn and, exchange information. And, it's just hard to understand. I realize it's important to see them at least initially and maybe 1 or 2 times, but all the other times, they have to go every 3 weeks. That's quite burdensome. Why not have some kind of remote, exchange? So I'd like to have you think about that. The other point that I want to make is dealing with informed consent. And when I think it's very necessary that we communicate I mentioned this yesterday, in clear, concise, simplistic language to patients. They need to understand all the parameters around clinical trial. And I've been confronted with situations where patients they didn't fully understand, and their insurance company, or they were charged out of pocket for things like, they got the medication, which was free, but they had to pay for the IV bag, and they had to pay for the needle and the nurse that administered the IV bag. And this is true, and it ended up with, thousands of dollars in bills that the insurance company only paid a certain portion of it. These things need to be communicated up front. People need to know what they're getting into, and I think the informed consent document needs to fully explain, all of the parameters and the conditions involved in the clinical trial. The last point I want to make is dealing with promising pathways. Especially if you're a terminal patient, what do you want from them? You want to you want to do everything possible to fight. And so, there are many, many restrictions dealing with this. And I think in some respects, I'm opening the Pandora's box here, but I think we should give some consideration and thought to creating promising pathways for those, especially those people that are terminal. They want one more bite of the apple. They want to try to save their lives. And if there's a way to do it, why are we pounding on all these restrictions? Why not help them? What do they have to lose? So these are things that I want to put out there for all of us to think about. Thank you.
Denise.
I have a question for Dr. Donahue. I'm aware that several groups within this sarcoma community have taken advantage of the FDA listening sessions. And I'm wondering if you can share with us from a standpoint of from a regulator, to what things are really important for you to hear from patients and patient advocates, and what's really meaningful as you're making the kinds of decisions that you need to make.
Thanks, Denise. I think the listening sessions are sessions that we have that are, just for those of you that haven't participated in them, they're programs that have been run by an area in FDA that generally are associated with bringing patients and advocates who are willing to speak to regulators about their experience as a patient, to talk about their experiences, not specific to a drug. It's unrelated to an application. It's more an information gathering opportunity for us, FDA, so that we understand the patient perspective in a sort of qualitative way, learn from a small group of people in an informal way about what it's like to have a certain disease, what things are important to them, what are the biggest challenges they've faced with the disease, what types of side effects in general they find most burdensome, what their primary symptoms are, et cetera. And it just gives us a better view of what's important to patients, which can come in the form of us thinking in a new way about an endpoint or a way to understand whether a drug is working or not. When we carry away those experiences from these sessions as we're thinking about providing advice to sponsors about trials, or when we're looking, maybe even a year, a couple years, 10 years down the road, at an application where we're trying to assess how meaningful is this particular change that we're seeing in this trial, whether it be a small response rate or a durability of response or a patient-reported outcome element. It helps us provide, get a better understanding and framework, and allows us essentially to try to put ourselves in the patient's position a little bit better as we're evaluating data. So I would say that for us, they're high value because our job is to serve the American people, right? And to do the best that we can when we're looking at an application or providing advice about a trial, that the data that we're getting are not only reliable and can assess the effect of the drug, but they really reflect, in the end, our ability to assess an outcome that we think is meaningful for patients. So I do find them very valuable. I am always very appreciative of people who go out on a limb and sometimes provide some really painful experiences to us that must make patients feel a little bit vulnerable. We had one a couple years ago, and parents of patients, pediatric patients with low-grade glioma came, and it was in a virtual environment, but they spoke to us about what it was like to have a child with low-grade glioma. We had some survivors of low-grade glioma speak, and all of that is highly meaningful to us and really important. So one of many opportunities for engagement and for us to kind of break down some of those barriers.
Okay. Well, I was going to just two quick comments. One to the last gentleman, and then maybe a question for you, Dr. Donahue, and that is very quickly. For you, I think decentralized clinical trials, I believe, is a game changer potentially. There are many ways to talk about it. So the more effort we put into defining, particularly though, the privacy issues that those raise and the safety and the quality of the data collection at remote sites, I think you agree with me, that will be the biggest challenge that we'll have to solve. So I think it's very important. But we haven't talked about machine learning, and one question I have, which I haven't seen a lot from the health authorities, is a whole opportunity that having digital twins as a way of getting data initially, right, before you go into human trials, could play in rare disease research. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
I have to admit, it's not my strength. That's my first thought. I think you're right. We have untapped, we have untapped resources at our disposal that I think we're just starting to learn about, right? And, I know that the agency is working very hard to try to advance programs such as this. In an ever-changing environment, that's a little bit difficult because we're gaining knowledge all the time, and the more, government doesn't always act quickly. So, I think that's something a challenge that we need to tackle. But I will say that, we would be interested in learning more about the opportunities related to digital twins. I think, as you rightly said, I think right now at least, they have the most promise in helping us understand which drugs, products, compounds have the most potentially to go into patients, or where's the bang for the buck, which products will maybe hold the most promise, so that we're studying products more efficiently and making better decisions at the very beginning before investing resources, patient resources, monetary resources into trials. So I do think that they're very important, and I'm happy to learn more about them, but I know that there are other very smart people at the FDA that know more about it than I do. But thanks for the question. And I just want to say, and I know we're standing between you guys and lunch or whatever the break is, but One thing we do feel very passionately about in our oncology office is incorporation of pragmatic elements into clinical trials, including decentralization. This is something that we really want to push for, and we're very willing to work with groups on how best to do that, because I think there are a lot of barriers out there to that, whether they be state regulations, other regulations, just sort of sticking with the way things are always done. There are other stakeholders that aren't always vested in or really wanting to change and shake things up, but that's something that we feel passionately about.
Martha, this question is for you. We have a registry, and I'm glad that Denise asked about the listening sessions, because that's certainly something that I know that I want to take advantage of, but there are other data that we're collecting as advocates. So many of us have initiated registries in different platforms, different ways, but these are, ethical structured data collection of patient experiences, patient-donated data. What does the FDA, what weight do you give to that? Do you give consideration to that when drug developers are coming and they want to demonstrate how patients are doing with, or just the natural history of the disease? Ochi, you highlighted natural history, but this is other data that's, it's just a different data set. Do you give some credibility to that at the FDA?
Yes. You're speaking about real-world data, real-world evidence, and irrespective of the source, I think, we have a whole group within the Oncology Center of Excellence that works on looking at real-world evidence and how best to use it. And in general, I would say, registry data in particular is a source of real-world evidence that has a high potential, because in general, it's prospectively collected. There's pre-specified, data elements. Patients generally, enroll and stick with it, and we know that it's being monitored and all of that. So I think registry data is rich. It can be used for a lot of things, and the more proximal you get to wanting to use that data for like a registrational intent type of purpose, the closer an eye on it we want to have in terms of being involved in it, if possible, in the beginning, so we understand which data elements are being collected, the frequency, the data provenance, like the potential to mitigate missing data and all of that. Like, I think the closer you get to like wanting to use that data for, a benchmark maybe, or something like that, that's, I think, the sooner that we're involved with that, the better, because there is a risk with relying on that data as well, because it has to have, elements, and it has to be accurate, it has to not be biased, and all those other things. So, but it is absolutely, particularly in rare diseases, I think it's very important. And, it's also extremely helpful for things like trial design. So, yes, it's they're important efforts.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We can, of course, continue this discussion for hours, but the slide with the breakout sessions is obviously the sign for me to close this session. And I would really like to thank all of you for joining us here, and thank you very much again. And of course, I will not miss to give you the chocolate. Okay, and yeah, thanks. So here you can see again the rooms for the breakout sessions, and we have 10-15 minutes break and start at 12. Thank you very much.